everybody. Excited to be able to be here with you guys all in Napa. I do admit this is my first time here in Napa, and I discovered last night that I'm allergic to Napa. I ended up having massive allergies last night, and so I mentioned this in the morning breakfast, and it's like the perfect kind of environment to admit to something like that, because then all of a sudden all these drug dealers come out of the woodwork and they start saying things like, oh, you need a little something, something. And so I'm a little hopped up right now. I may fall asleep and just curl up in this shag carpet. We'll see what happens as we go through this. So yeah, he mentioned, my name is Jeff Wiberg, and my story is that I started an organization in the Pacific Northwest and have been growing it ever since. And I come to these conferences and within our industry, and everybody talks about, oh, it's so hard to find employees. And I just kind of shrink down in my seat because I'm like, not for me. And that has been a really cool experience for us, but it hasn't been without an incredible amount of effort. And so I'm going to talk through some of the lessons that I learned in order to be able to get us to a place where we can say we don't have a recruiting problem at all at Family Resource Home Care. And so I call this overcoming that big, hairy problem. And in the Pacific Northwest, a big, hairy problem is something we call a Sasquatch. So I'm going to talk to you about how we overcame Sasquatch. So lesson number one is that we had to pay attention. We had to start paying attention, because initially I didn't have to pay attention to this at all. I've been recruiting caregivers since 2008, and for a long time, having a background in HR, I thought, okay, I know how to do this. I know how to recruit people. I know how to make this process work. And in all reality, we kind of recruit people and onboard them and screen them and all that kind of stuff the same way we have for almost 100 years. And so there's not been a lot of disruption. There's not been a lot of innovation in the way that we do this. We put out an ad, somebody says, I would like to apply for your position. And then we go through the same process of, tell me about your biggest weakness, and all of these inane questions and such during interviews and screening and testing and all that kind of stuff. And we had to discover that wasn't going to work anymore. And the way that we discovered that is, first of all, we weren't paying attention, actually. I mean, we were going for the sameness. We were kind of walking through thinking that it was always going to be just fine. And so we weren't paying attention to what I would call a lead indicator. And the lead indicator that I'm going to use today is just the pure number of applicants that we're generating on a weekly basis. Okay? So this is us. I'm going to go back to 2019, because that's when it was easy. And I'm going to go through the first part of the pandemic. This is what our recruiting pipeline kind of looked like from just a raw application standpoint. We were kind of continuing to go up. In fact, we hit a record in November of 2020. We thought everything is just fine. Now, November of 2020 was 4 months before the Great Resignation began. 4 months before. That was also our high point. Had I been closely paying attention, I would have noticed that over the course of the next 9 months, it would have gone the opposite direction. Well, remember that application count is a lead indicator. I didn't show up, it didn't start to show up in my employee census until summer of 2021, the same time that it showed up for everyone. And I started realizing we don't have enough employees. We got to really rethink this. So in August of 2021, we decided, okay, this is a crisis. Let's see what we need to do about this. So first lesson that I wasn't doing was, boy, I need to pay attention. And that certainly applies to the rest of my story about how we completely re-engineered the recruiting process at Family Resource Home Care. In other words, we finally could see the Sasquatch. We could finally see what we needed to improve upon. So lesson two kind of comes after you realize that you weren't paying attention. You need to be willing to eat humble pie. So we were like, okay, we were doing this wrong. We need to rethink everything. So we held this big old strategy session in August of 2021, and said, all right, let's rethink everything. Let's throw everything out onto the table. And let's actually be willing to challenge any assumption that we have about what this process should look like, what has worked, and what will work in the future. We believe that by this point, of course, even the talking heads on the television were saying, we're in a great resignation, and everybody in the industry was saying, oh, it's really hard to find people right now. In other words, we were describing a problem that we thought was not going to be able to be solved. We were accepting the idea that our groceries were going to be stolen by these Sasquatches, and there was nothing that we could do about it. So we wanted to also challenge the assumption that this was something that couldn't be solved, or that this is something that we didn't have to experience. And that was pretty audacious, I thought. So we set some pretty audacious goals. And remember that audacious goals will require resources. So we put our money where our mouth is. We did at the time, and the size of the company at this point was like about 30 million or so. So, a fairly small organization. We threw $1 million at this problem in August of 2021 as a $30 million company. So for us, that was a big amount of our bottom line that we decided, okay, we're going to dedicate as much resources as it's going to take in order to be able to make this happen. And we're going to challenge the assumption that we can't overcome this, and we're willing to redo everything in the process. And unfortunately, I don't have, especially in these 15 minutes, a silver bullet of what exactly we did. We did 150 things, incrementally different or incrementally better, that really yielded the difference that we needed to make. So we went through our entire process recognizing that if we don't get these caregivers, we're not going to be able to grow. It was the only growth inhibitor because the demand was seemingly unlimited. So lesson number 3 was we got to go open season. We did process measurements from top to bottom, yield ratios and A/B testing across the board throughout every single step of the process, down to the minutest detail. And this was very time consuming, it was labor intensive. We had to throw a lot of people at this in order to be able to effectively actually manage through understanding what our recruitment process was yielding us at every step of the way. We wanted to track every single applicant and what their experience was. We wanted to track every type of interview question and whether or not that yielded a better result than another, and really question everything and change what needed to be changing and just be willing to do that. So it was total open season on shooting Sasquatches, family resource, and it really worked. It worked really well. Anytime we identified any sort of leakage along the way, we plugged it up. Some examples of that. We decided we would stop asking on the application what your job history was. I didn't care whether or not you had any history as a caregiver. What we found was way more effective was, why do you want to be a caregiver for family resource home care? Open-ended question. And that single change was a better predictor as to whether or not somebody was going to be a good caregiver as opposed to what their job history was. So we stopped asking most of the questions. We're down to 5 questions on our application. And the reason why is because we were losing people who would start the application and not finish it because they're lazy. They wanted to be able to click apply now and do it in an instant. So instead we focused on values and said, okay, here's our core values. Here's a little bit about our culture. What speaks to you the most and why? That question ended up being a better predictor as to whether somebody was going to be a good fit for us as opposed to any other question that we had on our application. So those are some examples of how we were trying to think radically different. And it was very uncomfortable initially because folks wanted, well, what about, do they have 6 months or more of experience? And do they have a license to be able to practice? We didn't care. Those were not actually good predictors as to whether or not they were going to be a good caregiver or not. So we focused first on trying to get volume in the door so that we had good data to be able to work off of and understand, okay, as somebody goes through our pipeline, what works, what doesn't. And so we've wanted to get a lot of volume going, and so we put out ads everywhere, and we did different kinds of ads, and ads that were focused on boomers, and ads that were focused on millennials, and ads that were focused on people who cared about benefits, and ads that were focused on other things. So just all sorts of different types, and then we would look at the yield ratio for each one of those things and see what was working to drive volume. Once we had the volume, Then we went for efficacy and efficiency and making sure that we understood, okay, who was going to be successful 90 days after they started, and what was the recruitment process for that person? What brought that person into our door? And by doing this along every single one of our processes, we really started to hone in. I'll give you an example. We started with the goal of going from 4 to 1, meaning that for every recruiter that we had working the applicants, we'd get 4 caregivers. We wanted to get to 6 to 1 because that was the benchmark. Well, today we're at 13.4 to 1. So once we got to our goal, we just continued to challenge the assumption and say, well, okay, can we get to 7? Can we get to 8? Can we get to 9? Can we get to 10? And the answer was yes. And right now our goal is to get to 14. We're doing really well from that perspective. We went from 14 days from the time that somebody applied to the day that they started their first shift to now averaging between 1 and 3 days. For the time that they apply to starting, meaning earning wages. That was super key for us. The branding and messaging had to be completely and radically different based upon the stratification of these caregiver personas, of who they are and what motivates them, and what was the message that would resonate with them. And once we identified these personas, we created campaigns around each one of these things. I'll give you an example of that here. So we'd use a lot of testimonials that would talk directly and in unfiltered language. These are real quotes, they're not curated. And we have hundreds of these, and we push them out literally every single day with the story behind one of our caregivers talking about the company culture, because that's what's driving a lot of the engagement today. The other thing that's working really well today is we're showing upward mobility. So we're telling the story of caregivers who have then become office staff or branch managers, or what their career progression looked like. And even though this is only representative of about 50 people out of the 3,000 employees that we have, this drives an incredible amount of traffic, because folks that are looking for jobs today actually care about this. And so we articulate it, and it's driving a lot of our traffic today. This is just a quick example of things that we did radically different from what we had done previous to then, but before now. The problem is that you're going to end up with a bunch of FOMO. Like the supervisors that would supervise these caregivers were no longer involved in the process at all. They had to completely trust the recruiters, because before the recruiter would interview him, and then if that was good, they would schedule them with the supervisor, and the supervisor would say, okay, this is somebody we want to hire. Then the recruiter would extend an offer. There were so many times that this person would be passed along the process. It was inefficient. We were losing, we had too much leakage. What we found is that if one person with one conversation could get at the meat and potatoes of who this person is and make the decision right then and there, and by the way, this person is incentivized on not just whether or not they're hired, but whether or not they're with us 90 days later, that made all the difference in the world. However, we found we had to fight a lot of FOMO, managing through that change and helping people to gain trust throughout the organization, because some people within the organization didn't feel involved enough, and they had to either get on board or leave, was how dedicated we had to be to this particular process. We had to avoid that pride of authorship. Well, I didn't hire this person, so I'm not vested in their success. We had to align all of our incentives to combat some of that as well. And as well as give them the authority that if somebody's not going to work out, you can dismiss them, no problem, no questions asked. We had to make sure that they got comfortable with being uncomfortable throughout the process of our system. Then this final lesson that I had is keep it going. Don't be satisfied. Once we cracked the code, we were super excited, because 1 year after we started this, we went from years of 40 applicants a week to crossing 500 applications in a single week in 1 year. And we were so excited about that. Well, we said, well, let's just keep going. So in December 2023, we crossed 2,000 applicants in a single week. And we're averaging on a consistent basis over 1,500 applications every single week, giving us the ability to pick whomever we want. And we've gotten really good at picking who we want. That has facilitated our growth. So this is going back over the entire timetable now that I've discussed, going back 5 years, and you can see how consistent we were at that 40 per week, and then we completely retooled, and everything has been going up ever since. So we had 1,240 employees at that time. We've been able to 3x the business from a revenue perspective since that point, crossing over 3,000 employees by the end of 2023, which for us meant that was no longer the inhibitor for our growth. We no longer have a recruitment challenge. In other words, Sasquatch is just a figment of our imaginations at this point. We don't believe in Bigfoot at Family Resource Home Care. Now, my friends, I recognize that there's so much nuance and detail associated with exactly what we did. So this might be a teaser for you. And I want to make myself available if you want to reach out to me and say, well, how did you do this? Or how did you do that? Or tell me a little bit more about your process and such. Please feel free to reach out to me, because I would love for the entire industry to be able to say, we don't have a recruiting challenge as a home care industry, because we are a phenomenal destination employer, and that should facilitate the growth of everyone and anybody who's part of this industry. Thank you so much for letting me share.